India wasn't just only split in 1947, it was partitioned 5 times, arguably even more, and each one left scars that still bleed today. In this episode, I sat down with Sam Dalrymple, historian, storyteller, and author of Shattered Lands, The 5 Partitions of India, to uncover the forgotten fractures of the British Indian Empire. How big was the empire really?
It's a quarter of the world's population in a single British colony.
How many partitions were there, and why have most been erased from memory?
The 5 are, so the first one's the separation of Burma, 1937. This sets the precedent.
And what did the maps lie to us about?
The scope of the Indian Empire is often kept a secret. Like, they don't want to map the Gulf states as part of India.
This episode traces the legacy of empire, war, and memory across Bangladesh, India, Kashmir, Pakistan, Myanmar, and more, showing how the borders we live with today were forged in blood, bureaucracy, and betrayal. Watch to the end to understand how the past still shapes our present, and if you enjoy this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Want to dive deeper? Then you may want to order Sam Dalrymple's book via the link in our description below. Trust me, I've had the chance to read a preview copy, and it is worth its weight in gold. So let's get into it. You were mentioning earlier, Project Dastaan was the beginning of this whole thing. So for anyone who is not aware of what that project is and how did that all come about, why did you think it was important, and how does that project lead itself into this brilliant book that you've put together?
So all of this whole journey for this book kind of began around 2018 with 3 friends from university. We were in our final year, and my friends Sparsh and Amina basically had a conversation where they realized late at night, at 2 a.m. or something, that Amina's family, who lived in Pakistan, quite close to Sparsh's ancestral home, that his family couldn't go across to because of partition. Because 75 years after partition, India and Pakistan still don't operate a tourist agreement. So despite partition having had, the largest forced migration in human history, a kind of homecoming, a return, the ability to go home and see where you grew up is for most people, not everyone, but for most people very, very, very difficult. It's not quite the same, for example, with Bangladesh, where it has throughout the last 75 years had various different tourist schemes for both India and Pakistan. If you're growing up in Delhi, it's virtually impossible to go to Islamabad. If you're growing up in Lahore, it's virtually impossible to go to Amritsar, even though it's just 16 kilometers away. And so they had this realization that Sparsh's family lived quite near Amina's ancestral home, and Amina's family lived quite near Sparsh's ancestral home. And how great would it be to show each other's grandparents where they'd come from? And we kind of had this realization that we could do this. I think Sparsh came up with the idea of using virtual reality to try and take his grandfather home. And so the idea would be scan the old village, show him the old Gurdwara, the old mandir, show him the house where he grew up, and he really wanted to see this echoing hill where he used to kind of shout at the hill and it would echo back at him and all that kind of thing. And so me and Sadia, our other co-founder, were kind of joined about 2-3 days in. And we basically spent the next 3 years trying to do this for as many people as possible. The idea was that the 75th anniversary of partition was 2022. And by then we wanted to take back, 75 people before the 75th anniversary. We didn't quite manage to take back that number because of COVID. But the idea was that we'd take over kind of, 360 cameras, interview someone in one country, send a team from the other country to go track down where they came from, and then try to reconnect old friends. So there were at least 4 different times when, we managed to find someone's childhood best friend, or that kind of thing, which they hadn't spoken to in 75 years, which was amazing. So I grew up in Delhi. I'm a Scot, but Delhi raised. Family moved there in the 80s, basically. So I spent my whole childhood there. And doing this, several things happened. Firstly, it very quickly became evident that literally every single friend that I'd had growing up had these hidden stories of basically their families migrating across the border, but had never brought it up. Literally, friends I'd known since year 2, since kind of early 2000s or whatever, would suddenly pop this mad migration story on me about how they'd lost everything and come across the border. And I kind of got into the, partition had always lingered in the background of every conversation in Delhi dinner tables. Growing up in Delhi, it's just there. Yeah. It's an ever-present fact of life. But the more that I got into it, the more that I realized that every single one of my friends had a migration story. I also discovered very quickly that my granddad passed away, and he'd always refused to come out to visit us in India. despite my parents living there for 40 years. And the day before his funeral, we looked through his old World War II photo albums, and there was one from Delhi. He'd never told us he'd been to Delhi, really, but there in this photograph was basically he'd been there for partition as a young 20-year-old soldier who'd been brought in during World War II. And he basically, the story that we think is the case is basically he'd been traumatized. All of his friends had been put on a train, never made it to the other side. And as a 20-year-old, he decided then, presumably, that he basically never wanted to go back. And so despite his son and grandkids all living in India, could not bring himself to ever go back to Delhi because it was just associated with those kind of memories. So that's kind of how I came into the partition, I guess, and have now been working in, I guess, kind of preserving oral histories, etc., for almost, just under a decade, like 8 years now. And I have a very clear, do you know Anchal Malhotra, who's an amazing oral historian in Delhi as well? I have a very vivid memory of when early Dastaan years, when we were basically a bunch of bright-eyed college kids, who were like, we're going to take everyone back using virtual reality. We're going to change the world. And she just literally sat opposite us at a cafe in Oxford and was just like, you will traumatize everyone. You guys need to know what you're doing. And then proceeded to basically teach us about oral history techniques and how to go about it. Because obviously it's the kind of thing that you can't just rush into. You can't just kind of charge into. These are memories, emotionally layered, filled with kind of all sorts of traumatic memories, but also, if done the right way, can be an incredibly healing experience, not just for them, but for their whole family and the younger generations who get to learn about their family history, etc.
Do the politics of now color people's memories? So when they were looking back, it's actually kind of like, rather than telling you what occurred then, they're almost like...
So I'll give you a story on exactly that, which is that one of the first interviews that we did was with this man, Iqbaluddin. Okay, he's Pakistani. He came from what's now East Punjab, from near Ropar, a village called Chakkarma, and then he migrates to Lahore. When we first start asking him about partition and his memories, he literally just bangs on about the genocide of Muslims, yes, and kind of like how it was all a plot and how you can never trust a Hindu, you can never trust a Sikh. This was pre-planned, etc., etc., etc. And how he's never been able to. There's no redeemable Indians whatsoever, etc. Literally, about 20 minutes, half an hour into the conversation, we ask him, do you remember any, do you remember any places that you really want to go back to? And then we ask, are there any friends? When we ask about his friends from before partition, he's like, there's one man who I want to see again, and it's my Sikh friend Narendra Singh. And the way that it's exactly that. People learn their nationalist narrative. He was telling us all about Gandhi and Jinnah and Nehru and Mountbatten and how this kind of, the rise of the Muslim League and it was this story that didn't include him. It was this story that didn't include his family.
It's their version of history.
It's their version of history, but the moment that we asked him about his best friend, it was Narendra Singh, who is the one person he wants to visit in the world again. And he has a picture of Narendra Singh in his wallet to this day. And we managed to reconnect him with Narendra Singh's wife, Kuldeep Kaur. Narendra Singh had sadly passed away. But Narendra Singh's family was living in just basically outside Chandigarh. And she knew of Narendra Singh and had a photograph of so she knew about Iqbal but had never known what he looked like, because they'd lost touch in the 50s. I think managed to exchange letters for a few years after partition, but then I think with the 65 war was when letters stopped being able to go across and that kind of thing. But so yeah, I feel like with the rise of kind of Hindu nationalism, etc., you get exactly the same thing, but on the other side, right? You get people who will tell you Muslims do this, Muslims do this, and then the moment you ask them about their pre-partition best friends, it's like, oh well, there was this even Sparsha's family, right? Sparsha's family, who are all very much BJP, like his nana and all. But when we and that's kind of because of the experience of migration and partition, and yet it was two Muslims who saved them during the riots. It was a guy called Sher Khan and another guy I can't remember the name of. But so these memories are layered, and again we managed to find the man the family who'd saved their lives during partition, and they created a WhatsApp group. And right to the end of Sparsh's granddad's life, they were communicating on WhatsApp. But it was very weird because, Sparsh's family were all, that side of the family were all very much like hardcore BJP, very much kind of like, had all sorts of, mistrust towards Muslims. Not sort of, but definitely kind of, ooh, what's going on here? And likewise, on the other side, you had, these guys all celebrating, the guys in the village were all celebrating when the Taliban took Kabul. And they were having these funny conversations on WhatsApp being like, oh, you realize the Taliban don't like guys like us who was like, no, but you're our brothers. And it's this funny little conversations that you can make with these connections. Like, I don't know, very weird.
Yeah, no, it must be because you're kind of, there's so many identities that are almost people are like filtering through as they're telling you these stories. So I can well imagine. Okay, well, coming back with your book, you open with the assertion that in 1928 the Indian Empire encompasses regions as diverse as Yemen, Burma, and the Gulf states. Now, as we were talking about earlier, even for someone who's got a history degree and who thinks he's fairly well read, it was a bit of a shock to read how big the British Indian Empire actually is, because I think when you say Indian Empire, British Indian Empire, Raj, people's idea is India, what is today India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that kind of area. But actually it's far bigger and it stretches from essentially the Gulf states all the way to Burma, which is bordering Thailand. So it's absolutely massive. I guess a few questions, which is, why did you bother to take such a broad scope? Like, why is that why was that your objective? But then also in terms of historically, why was the empire administered like that? Like, why was the British Indian Empire encompassing places that were geographically not what we would say is India?
Sure. So the whole thing, as I was mentioning to you before we started this podcast, the whole project really begins when we are trying to, during Project Dastaan, we began around 2019, 2020, just before COVID, trying to actually do a broader project on how partition affected the whole subcontinent. And so not just focusing on Punjab and Bengal, but, how it affected places like Lucknow, how it affected Hyderabad, how it affected, in particular, northeast India, which was massively destabilized by basically the kind of massive influx of refugees. And it was while I was chatting to someone from Tripura, and I was asking about how partition affected the area. I can't remember what his name was, but he literally just said which one? And I was like, what? And he's like, well, first we had an influx of refugees after the 37 partition of when Burma was separated. And I was like, oh, okay. And then 47 with the creation of India and Pakistan. And then 71 when Bangladesh broke off from Pakistan. And each one in the local memory was etched as another partition, another influx of refugees. And so that got me really questioning, because I don't think Burma ever features in conversations about India. Ever. I think Thant Minh Oo, who's one of the great writers on Burma, talks about visiting Delhi and, hearing that, that in Delhi, in India, there are no good Burmese speaking experts. When you chat to people about Rangoon, etc., there's a kind of sense that, some ancestors may have worked there once, and there's songs like Mera Piya Gaye Rangoon. All those kind of songs, but no one really knows it, and it doesn't feature in any of the nationals' stories that we tell ourselves.
It also almost seems racially, it's almost seen as different, and I think that almost,
despite the languages of 4 Indian states being closely related, Nagaland, Mizoram, bunch of the languages in Meghalaya and Arunachal Pradesh are all related to Burmese. It's not like we don't have states in India today that are related to those languages, right? And so I began to try and basically figure out, okay, what was India when the first Indian passports were given out? And I remember literally just on Google, I was Googling a bunch of images, and there was this image of a Indian Empire passport. That's what it was called back then, the Indian Empire. And the Indian Empire passport was given to a Yemeni Jewish woman in Aden who was trying to migrate to mandate Palestine after the Balfour Declaration. And I was like, wait, so just by living in Aden, this city in what's now Yemen, you would be classified as Indian to get a passport. And the more that I looked, then you go to the list of princely states. Okay, what does that look like? Alphabetically, it starts with Abu Dhabi. And you're like, and so just mapping it all together gives you a much vaster swathe of the world than you necessarily think. Basically, it's a quarter of the world's population in a single British colony. But crucially, even in British official documents, the scope of the Indian Empire is often kept a secret. Like, they don't want to map the Gulf states as part of India on official maps because it's thought that it would aggravate Constantinople in the days of the Ottoman Empire. Basically. And and then later after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, they don't want to aggravate Saudi Arabia, that's basically got some claims in the desert, etc. And so they don't quite have a defined border inland in the early days. And so they never depict it. They occasionally depict Yemen, Aden, and they always depict Burma. In the 1909 maps, you also get Nepal and Bhutan. So, but they're very, we look at these maps as very much just portraying things how they are, but often there's things left out. And there's political reasons behind it. But if you look at the official definition that the Viceroy himself gives India, I think it's the Interpretation Act of 1889, it defines India as this whole swathe from Yemen all the way to Burma.
And that is mainly for administrative purposes then?
For administrative purposes, basically what happens is when the East India Company's nationalized, so basically, they nationalize this company, and then the India Office, as it's known, takes over all the territories that the East India Company, the EIC, had taken over. And so it's just India is just suddenly defined as all of these places. It actually, at the moment that it's nationalized, it also includes a couple of places like Hong Kong and Singapore, and I think bits of Somalia as well. But those within the first kind of 6 years are broken off. What's weird is that the rest stays right until the end.
So had the EIC been called I don't know, the East English Company, it would have just been called. So it's basically they inherited the name then. So the Indian Empire.
So
came
the
from
Indian
East India.
Empire is just the bits that, the territories that are inherited from
the East India Company.
Exactly.
So had the company been called something else.
But what we underestimate is how much being governed as part of the same territory and having the same passport means that. One of the biggest discoveries in doing the book is how many nationalists living in Yemen in the 30s, some of the founding fathers of modern Yemen, are actually Indian National Congressmen who used to go on road trips with Ambedkar. And but are later told by basically and likewise, the greatest political figure in Burma in the 1920s is called Mahatma Ottama, named after Gandhi.
Yeah.
And he spends his entire career trying to persuade people that Burma should remain a part of India. And but it's bizarrely, a lot of these earlier places are broken off ultimately because during the early nationalist movement, the nationalists rally around basically creating a nation that resembles the Bharatvarsh of the Mahabharata, and this Hindu sacred holy land that stretches from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from basically Balochistan to Assam, but doesn't include Burma, and it doesn't include the Arabian Peninsula. And so it's in the 20s and 30s that Burmese nationalists and Arab nationalists begin to diverge. And so there's a very funny way in which you could imagine a united India that included the united Gulf states as well as Burma, the remaining part of an independent India to this day.
Could that have been a possibility? Or was that a very slim,
Slim, but it's possible.
Wow, okay. And would that have banked on mainly India being more of a secular type of cosmopolitan nation rather than the Hindu Varsh type of idea?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the reasons that early I think each partition that happens acts like a domino on the next. So in a way that I think we often ignore. So a lot of the guy who coins the term Pakistan, Rahmat Ali Chaudhry, literally writes, I don't understand why the Muslims are being kept, Muslim majority areas are being kept as a part of India if Burma and the Arab states were allowed to be separated. And so he sees that as the precedent for the creation of Pakistan. He says, like, if the Burmese are separating on the basis that they're, ethnically and religiously different, why can't we separate the northwestern bits of India too? And that is obviously leads to all sorts of, but each one acts like a domino on the next in ways that if we ignore Burma, if we ignore Yemen, we miss the origins of the idea of Pakistan.
Yeah, you missed the beginning of the movie.
You missed the beginning of the movie, exactly.
Yeah. How would you understand that? Coming to then the 5 distinct partitions, which are obviously central to your book, could you walk us through each of these and explain how they collectively contributed to the fragmentation of the Indian Empire and how we view a map of the modern world today? So I know we've mentioned it, but like the fact that the Arab world could have technically been or continued to have been part of what we view as India. And then a second question, which I'll ask you further down the line, is were there ever, considering the Arab world is relatively poor at the point they are split off, and then soon after they become tremendously rich, were there any claims from India or Pakistan to try and retake the territory? But we'll come back to that in a minute. First, let me know about the 5 partitions, and then we'll go through that.
So the 5 are, so the first one's the separation of Burma, 1937. This sets the precedent. This is the first, this is the thing that really sets everything off. There's a growing sense from kind of the early 20th century through to 37, when it finally happens, that Burma is not India and that its path should be different. But Rangoon, the capital, is the biggest emigration port in the world. It overtakes New York. But as a result, basically, it's filled with people from elsewhere in the Indian Empire, and the Burmese themselves basically feel like they're being kicked out of all their jobs, and so you get Burmese nationalists as well as Hindu nationalists saying that this isn't part of Bharat. You also get Burmese nationalists saying like we're being swamped by immigrants, and so it's separated in 1937, and the border where it's drawn will basically cleave the Nagaland in half. So half of all Nagas live in or a third of all Nagas live in Burma, 2/3 of Nagas live in India. Also leaves, for example, the Rohingya stranded in what's now Burma, despite being kind of speaking a dialect of Bengali and being basically Bengali Muslims to some extent, even though they've been living in that land for centuries, right? You also cleave like Mizos in half. And so there's all these communities who are very much stranded, and it is a partition. The second partition begins the same year, the separation of the Gulf states. And that begins with the separation of Aden, which is this kind of westernmost city of India. It's now in what's now southern Yemen, but was the western, it was the beginning of India for everyone visiting India by ship back in the day, steamship from, you stopped there, and that was the first point of call. But it separated in 37, and gradually over the next decade, all of the other states in the Gulf are basically separated off one by one. It's not all at one moment, it happens over about 10 years. But the last of the Gulf states are literally only separated in April 47, just before the actual partition happens. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that our vision of undivided India basically only exists for 5 months. This image of undivided India, which stretches from Balochistan to Assam and Nagaland and Kashmir to Kanyakumari, only exists between April and August 1947. It doesn't exist ever outside of that. There's no country that looks like that in history outside of April to August 1947.
So go any other time. So go the month before that. How does India look?
Or a month before that, it's got Dubai as being ruled from Delhi, and the Indian civil service running the civil service in Dubai, the Indian political service running the politics, the Persian Gulf residency working exactly the same way that, for example, the Hyderabad residency works, where there's a kind of Brit sitting there governing the princes, and these princely states, the princes of the Gulf, the sheikhs, sultans, etc., are treated in exactly the same way as the maharajas of kind of Rajasthan are. And so they're all invited to the Delhi Darbars, and they show up on their elephants and kind of for imperial spectacle.
But because of their level of wealth at that time, they're not seen as important.
They are given, with the exception of Oman, they're pretty much all given 0 gun salutes, as opposed to Jaipur, which is 21, and Hyderabad, which is 21, and Jaipur, which is 18. Even these small states that no one's ever heard of today in India, that there's a bunch of ones in Chhattisgarh that had 11. gun salutes, and yet the Gulf states are the poorest states in the entire Indian Empire. And it's only in the course of basically the 40s and 50s, like even when it's separated in April 47, like the Gulf state, no one knows that the oil is coming.
Yeah.
And so when it's separated off, you literally have telegrams from the from politicians in Delhi being like, it's curious to us why no one in India, none of these Indian officials want to inherit the states of the Gulf. They literally turn it away. Because they see it as just like, the Brits giving us extra work and like a bunch of like people to look after and stretch our resources thin.
What's the idea at that point in terms of what might become of these Gulf states? Is it very much like let them see kind of what they can achieve?
Well, so they were protectorates, and they were slightly more loosely governed essentially than any of the other princely states. And so it was I think more the Brits wanted to, like, the Brits first show up there basically firstly to stop piracy, which is their excuse, but realistically to, for example, as a stopping point for kind of P&O cruisers and for kind of like electricity lines and that kind of thing, oil lines. Oil is beginning. Oil is more like, the oil world. Iran, they already know, has lots of oil, and there's the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and they've struck a bit in the Gulf, so they know it's there. But far bigger at this point is the pearling industry. So it's a bunch of people, basically all of the pearls in the Maharaja of Patiala's necklaces all come from the Gulf, because it was literally the whole economy ran up on pearling as late as the kind of 20s. And it's only in the 40s and 50s that sort of like oil overtakes pearling as the great industry of the Gulf.
Okay, and then I know we'll go through the other partitions in a minute. Is there ever then a claim from India once they do strike oil to... No, there's not.
There are, so it's very much, I think we forget how much all of the, like, none of the princely states were particularly forced to join one of the other.
Yeah.
And particularly because they were across the sea, and because their treaties with the British were such that, when they'd been transferred over, they
You relinquish all rights type of thing.
And so I think that the way that, the transfer of power happened in 47, like, they were never given rights over that bit. It had just basically been a different bit of the British Empire. But had Dubai stayed on the princely states list 5 more months, it would have been there when Sardar Patel and VP Menon and these, like, Indian officials were asked to basically kind of, try and get them to integrate. But they just weren't on the list
because by that point they'd been cleaved off.
Exactly.
Yeah, fair.
So the other 3 partitions, very quickly, are the partition of British India.
Yes. So that's the partition everyone would think of when we say partition.
Partition that everyone would think of, the division of Punjab and Bengal. You've also got the partition of princely India. So one of the things I found fascinating again is how much these princely states were not divided by religion in the same way as British India, like the directly ruled bits. Maharajas had basically full sovereignty over their internal matters, and they are given a choice over whether to join India, Pakistan, or remain independent. And I think the narrative that I grew up with in Delhi was, all the Hindu ones wanted to join India, all the Muslim ones wanted to join Pakistan. Actually, what I found is pretty much only one, Bikaner, was the only state that wanted to unanimously join the country that's religion aligned with it. Every single other one thinks about joining other states, and you can completely imagine a Pakistan that includes Jodhpur and Jaisalmer, for example, in Rajasthan, because they literally, both Maharajas consider joining Pakistan. You also get, like, a bunch of these Christian states in Meghalaya, in northeast India, basically kind of sending over messages to the Muslim League saying, what can you offer us? Because we're Christian, we're neither Hindu nor Muslim. So, like, what
and we probably fit in more with Muslims than we
exactly.
would with,
but literally the Muslim League doesn't reply, or replies too late. And so they're like, well, these guys aren't gonna.
They're not even reliable.
They're not even reliable. So we'll join India.
Yeah.
And which, but like so many of these border states were basically asking for the best deal.
One part in your book that I remember is you talk about some of what we would now call border states in terms of with the with the modern map of Pakistan and India. And you say that a couple of, if I remember correctly, a couple of them decide, and because that essentially locks the border, the princely states that are further inland almost don't have a choice.
Yeah. So all of the states have an option to join one or the other, and a bunch of these states really far inland into India are considering to join Pakistan. There's a state called Dujana that's in modern Haryana, just next to Delhi, tries to join Pakistan, and Jinnah literally has to turn it down because, like, you've not got an airport, and you're literally
Next to Delhi.
You're next to Delhi, like, or just beyond Gurgaon.
We'll get invaded.
Like, yeah, exactly. Whereas, and so what the Indian government basically very quickly realizes, it's like, to stop absolute madness happening, they need to lock in 4 states to create a border from the sea all the way through to Punjab. And if they can just get 4 states, which are Kutch, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, and Bikaner, if they can get these 4 states, it basically creates a wall of India that locks off the rest of the country from Pakistan. And they do it. Yeah. But both Jodhpur and Jaisalmer literally, like, almost join Pakistan. And I cannot tell you how close it is. The turning point, he's about to sign to join Jodhpur, the lovely blue city that all the tourists visit, is about to join Pakistan. Jinnah says, ask me whatever you want. Like, I will sign, you just write your demands. And he considers, and he says, literally, let me go home, and I'm just going to take a bit of time to consider. And he's considering it. And it's literally his mum and his guru who basically convince him out of it. But, like, had it not been for his mum and his religious guru...
Oh, was his mum the one that the politicians go and get his mum and bring him in order to... Yeah, I remember reading that going that... And I think if I pull out my notes, I've got a note saying that's such an Indian tactic. How else to get someone to listen to them get their mum in, right?
But so that's the partition of princely India, and 81% of the modern India-Pakistan border is essentially decided by a bunch of princes, as opposed to Radcliffe. Radcliffe pretty much draws all of the Bangladesh border, the East Pakistan and India border. But actually, in the West, he only divides Punjab. The rest of that border that we all call the Radcliffe Line now is actually basically decided by princes who choose to join one state or the other. And so we could imagine a very different border.
And are there any Sikh princely states at this point who make a decision, or would that have been decided with?
None of them are on. None of them are on the border.
List by that point.
None of them are on the border.
Oh, fine. So it doesn't matter really.
Yeah.
So they're almost dictated by
exactly. And then so finally, the 5th partition that I talk about is the partition of Pakistan itself. So in 1971, and we can get into this in more depth later. But a big thing that I argue in the book is that the map of modern South Asia is actually made in 1971. It's not in 1947. And that, for years you get kind of Bengalis increasingly basically kind of pushed out of government jobs in the Pakistani state, particularly once the military comes in. Actually, a lot of the early Pakistani prime ministers are Bengali. But once the military comes in, the military is pretty much all Punjabi. And Bengalis, despite making up the majority of Pakistan's population, are kind of pushed out of all the government jobs because all of them are going to military men. There are basically no Bengalis in the military.
Okay, and in your book, you talk about how a lot of that is down to inheriting like martial race theories and ideas that Bengalis aren't soldiers. Yeah.
Bengalis are too...
effeminate and...
Actually, that was... Like, the British make that rule because of the fact that the Bengalis were their main enemies in 1857.
Yes.
And so...
and then twisted the whole narrative because they were using Bengalis up until that point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so basically in 1971, you get Mujibur Rahman, Bengali politician, wins the Pakistani election. Pakistani rulers refuse to basically let him take over because he's only won the vote in East Pakistan and they don't think that he should take over. He basically comes near to declaring independence. They send in the army, then they do declare independence. And after the most brutal, bloody war in modern South Asian history, which I call the Great South Asian War, it's the first time in history that you've got basically the full subcontinent at war, is December 71. So you get 8 months of basically kind of Bangladeshi rebels trying to kind of push the Pakistani army out. Then India joins. Then Bangladesh becomes an independent nation. And you get, from 1971 to 1974, they have to basically divide assets. Bangladesh is now independent. And although the word partition doesn't tend to be used when it comes to Bangladesh, actually it's another partition. You suddenly have to figure out which people belong in which country, which which banks, who gets which assets from the old Pakistani infrastructure.
I think that's the point where your story of the banker who gets robbed twice, and the first time he manages to fob them off and send them away, but then second time they come in and they steal
all the money. From Dhaka Bank. And so the year 1971 is not only the year that Bangladesh gets independence, but pretty much the same month you get the British finally pulling out of the Gulf. So the final British presence in what was the Indian Empire comes to an end. And India and Britain, having just lost basically the last remnants of its Indian Empire, decides to join a new economic union, which is the EU. Literally.
I remember reading that going, that's a very good connection. Yeah.
So 1971, I think it's obviously, everyone from Bangladesh very much knows about 71. I think growing up in India, it's not talked about enough. And in Pakistan, there's even more silence around it.
Oh, there was a question I wanted to ask you based off something, and now I have completely forgotten.
Don't worry.
Which is great. Oh, balls. Oh yeah. That was it. Which is, as I was reading the chapters to do with the partition of Pakistan, independence of Bangladesh, it seems to me, and hence why I'm putting this question to you, Indira Gandhi takes the opportunity to kind of press her iron will and show her force by backing Bangladesh and helping it to gain independence. And it's really interesting because you just have to change Bangladeshi, like what's the freedom fighter group called in Bangladesh now?
Dibahini.
That's it. If you change that for argument's sake, the Khalistan Commando Force or some other secessionist movement, the response is completely the opposite. So here, it almost seemed as she was jumping to help exacerbate the problem because it benefited the fact that it split Pakistan in two. Whereas when it's an internal matter, then that Bharat Varsh is challenged, and therefore she has to show that she is Durga, as she was so poetically referred to sometimes. So is that a fair analysis, or do you think that, like, actually if you were to look at more of the context, that doesn't necessarily add up?
No, I think there's no denying that the two are intrinsically linked. So for the first 10 years after independence, India and Pakistan are actually remarkably on side. They're fighting over Kashmir, but they're not actually interfering that much with each other's internal politics.
And at this point, the border's not as solid as it is today.
And people can cross over, and it's, you've got the Bhuttos keep their Indian passports despite living in Karachi. The Bhuttos keep their Indian passports until the mid-50s. And, Jinnah's tomb is designed by an Indian Muslim. So there's this ability for people to cross over. From 61, you get first, basically, India goes into Goa, and Pakistan's president, Ayub Khan, freaks out. He starts funding, basically. He thinks that India's got these irredentist claims that it's going to try and recreate a kind of greater India. And in order to basically kind of undermine India, he starts funding rebels from Nagaland and Mizoram in India. And that's the first documented in declassified intelligence files. That's the first thing that we can see where, funding rebels to kind of break apart each other.
And you discussed that quite a bit in your book, don't you?
India very quickly, as a tit-for-tat response, starts funding basically kind of Bengali separatists who want to create what's now Bangladesh, basically. And although for years there's been all sorts of denials in official channels, you can see it very clearly in all these declassified intelligence files. India, it's harder to get access to the Pakistani files, and in Bangladesh, so many of the pre-71 paperworks were just burnt and during 71. But in India, there are all sorts of amazing paperworks where you can see this. The other thing that's fascinating is in the middle of the Bangladesh war, okay, when India is full-on backing Bengali rebels to try and basically create an independent Bangladesh. It's worth saying that, these Bengali rebels are very much, I think a lot of Bangladeshis get quite irritated when they talk about kind of, India, like when Pakistanis accuse India of having created Bangladesh. It's like, as in, the Pakistani administration pushed these guys into a corner, and when Indian money came along, they weren't going to oppose it.
Yeah.
But one of the fascinating things that I found in these like declassified intelligence files is reference like Indians discover in December 1971, 2 days into the war, that that the Pakistani government has just made contact with the Khalistani movement for the first time, and the first funding of Pakistan's first sending of money towards the Khalistan movement to try and create an independent thing is literally, the quote is, to create a Bangladesh-style situation in Indian Punjab. So that's the first time, like, it's a direct response to what India's doing in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
And you've got that on paper in these intelligence files. You can see, I mean, obviously, we don't have the Pakistani like side,
Yeah.
but you can see what the Indian reports are saying at the time in 1971, and they're saying, you know, something's going on because, you know, like there's all sorts of movement where they're trying to, you know, like link up with all these guys
in Punjab.
in Punjab, and the first intercept is them as a tit for tat response. So,
And India is obviously doubly worried then, I guess, because they've seen what can happen in terms of Bangladesh, and then they're seeing these reports that money may be going into Punjab. And so is that then perhaps why the response is as violent as it is? Like, as in, or is that perhaps like assuming too far?
I think so. I think that the irritating thing is what these proxy wars do. Like India and Pakistan are continually, you know, it allows plausible deniability. Oh, we're not funding anyone. Oh, you know, like,
Yeah, but even recently, didn't the Pakistan foreign minister, I can't remember what government minister it was, but it was on Sky News, and he was basically asked a question. I'll put the clip on here when this goes out. But he's basically asked a question by the news anchor, and he's like, yeah, we have armed loads of separatist groups in the past before, but we've been doing it on behalf of other governments. And that was recorded like 4 months ago. So
I think, I mean, so yeah, I think that there's no doubt that so much, like when we focus on the India-Pakistan conflict, we tend to focus on the moment that it's like a hot war, right? And not enough on the Cold War that's been going on between them. And unfortunately, you know, it's only with hindsight that we can actually know what's going on. Like, so for example, with the last, you know, 3 decades, we don't actually know the real story and won't until files are declassified.
yeah.
And this is always the thing with historians, right? So like you're always 30 years kind of too
Yeah,
late,
yeah.
because it's only 30 years later that you can really begin to actually see what the actual
The real
reports are.
story is, yeah.
And it's what's amazing is that until kind of, you know, the mid 80s, you now can, there's an amazing swathe of new scholarship suddenly coming out. And I might do a shout out to Avinash Paliwal's book, India's Near East, which is the first proper in-depth study basically of India and Pakistan's proxy war and their funding of separatist groups in each other's countries. And I found it amazing because literally, you know, like there's so many books that you read which take interviews and like, you know, this guy said this guy said this, and it's kind of all conjecture. You don't really know who was funding who and what was going on. He's the first person to really go through basically everything that's been declassified for every country in the region. And it's really good. And it's fascinating how much, you know, these narratives have been built kind of based on hearsay. And his book was, for me at least, the first time that I was like, oh, wait, like we can know what happened up until a certain date because these documents are out. It's just there aren't that many scholars going into the archives and knowing that, you know, the Indian government doesn't announce when these things have been declassified. The British government doesn't announce when things have been declassified. You've just got to know what's going on.
Just keep checking. Yeah.
And, you know, just as we can now have major rewritings of World War II based on all sorts of memories of, you know, like Indian soldiers and African soldiers as well as the Brits in the British Army. I think that the same is kind of now increasingly happening for the 60s and 70s. We're having a much more holistic view of these like events that were further back in time, I guess.
One of my questions is about the Arabian frontier and how obviously a lot of people are unaware of places like Oman, Bahrain, the UAE, Dubai, like the list goes on, were once under the administrative control of the British Indian Empire. The question is, how did the detachment of these territories reshape the landscape of the Middle East and South Asia? which I think is a little bit too broad. So I just want to narrow it a little bit. You mentioned that when they were cleaved off, they're not cleaved off in one go, in that it's still being administered as a kind of an Arabian empire, perhaps, is one for better words. What is the process then that's involved in actually splitting them off into those smaller little chunks? And what are the, like, how do those claims work? Because one thing that was really interesting reading the whole book was how you could almost have the same claim to whatever that is, whether that's like it should be a Hindu nation because of the religion, or it should be based on language, or it should be based on something else. Even if the claim was the same, often the result, or kind of what happened to that area, was really different and varied. So even as you were saying, some of these princely states, although they may have been very similar in certain aspects, some of them are picking like completely different to one another, right?
So the Gulf states are always viewed as slightly exceptional. As I mentioned earlier, they're always kept off the maps for kind of secretive reasons. But they're always basically governed by two residencies. So there's the Aden residency, which governs kind of basically the bits that become Yemen. Yeah. And then there's a Persian Gulf residency that basically governs Bahrain, etc. Yeah. Like Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Oman, like that kind of region, Kuwait. Crucially, though, there's one weird thing that should be said, which is that what's weird is Oman and Nepal, by the way, in the other end of the empire, both have treaties with the British saying we are completely independent. The Brits just treat them as princely states for all intents and purposes. So they're called kind of informal princely states because they're gonna literally follow all the rules and regulations of being a princely states. They're gonna be governed by the Indian political service. They're gonna be defended by the Indian army. They're gonna use the Indian rupee. They're gonna be eligible for Indian passports, and they're gonna do all their kind of like tax filing in Bombay. But like Oman was never. Like you'll chat to Omanis today, and they'll be like, "No, we were always independent because look, here's our treaty."
Oh,
and so there's a funny thing with
but
that.
actually, in practice, it's not necessarily the case.
It wasn't necessarily the case, and likewise with Nepal. Nepal is very proud of having always remained independent because, like, here's our treaty. But you've got kind of this strange. It shows up on all the kind of like lists of princely states.
Yeah,
it shows up under the administration of the viceroy. So basically, in 1937, you get the separation of all the states that will become part of future Yemen. Okay, so everything from Aden in the west to this area called Mahra in the east, which basically bordered the border of modern day Oman and Yemen. So that area is separated off in 1937, and the rest are basically transferred to separated off in April 1947, as I mentioned. The way that they do it is that they just hand over the exact same administration, but take it out of the viceroy's purview and give it to the colonial office. So they just give it to Whitehall in London.
Oh, mad. Okay.
So rather than being... So basically all of the Indian civil servants set sail for Bombay, and a bunch of new white administrators show up who've basically come from Whitehall. But the situation remains the same, and so you get all sorts of memoirs. There's this fascinating memoir of this guy called Holden, who goes and becomes the Arabian correspondent for, I think it's the Times. Yeah. And he's constantly writing, I expected all sorts of bizarre things, but I'd never expected to constantly be, singing God Save the Queen and cheer for the Empress of India. And then see these kind of sultans wandering around in old Indian military uniforms, and see everyone having curry lunch in the style of the old Indian administrative service. And he goes around and finds that all these sultans are better at speaking Urdu than they are Arabic, the sheikhs, because they were all studying at Mayo College in Rajasthan, in Ajmer, rather than, so their education was in Urdu. And then they come back here and have to learn Arabic in order to get on with their peers who they're meant to be ruling. So that's going on remarkably late, and right into the kind of 60s. The the Arab nationalism is taking force, particularly in the wake of Suez, and you've got, and particularly in the wake of, the other partition of Israel and Palestine, and all of that. That galvanizes Arab nationalism and makes this whole region think increasingly in terms of being Arab in an Arab world, as opposed to being part of the Indian world, which it was in the past. And so you get this generational shift. Whereas in the 20s, all the young kids from posh families in kind of Qatar are all being educated in Rajasthan. Like suddenly all the kids are being, like by the 1950s and 60s, they're all being educated in Beirut and Cairo. The other weird thing with that whole region is, so I mean, it's crucially also to say, I don't think a lot of the Gulf ever considered themselves Indian.
No.
And like, whereas bits of Yemen did. So as in, you know, like there were nationalists sitting in Aden, the big city of its day, very much sitting, you know, we're governed by the Viceroy of India. We've got Indian passports. Our politicians are all the Indian National Congress, and increasingly saying maybe we're Indians, maybe we're just Arab Indians, basically. And particularly a lot of these guys in this area called Kayati State, whose ruler
that
was
features quite a lot in your
yeah,
book, doesn't it? Yeah.
The ruler was the nephew of the Nizam of Hyderabad, basically, or sorry, grandnephew. His mum was the niece, but he very much thinks of himself as both kind of, you know, both an Arab ruler and an Indian vassal to the Nizam. And so I think in Yemen there is a sense that kind of gradually, like, you know, Yemen is becoming Indian, and like it's possible to think of yourself as both, like, you know, just in the same way it's possible to think of yourself as Punjabi and Indian or Tamil and Indian. Arab was just an ethnicity of the Indian Empire of India. And that was in much the same way as Burmese people increasingly thinking about themselves as Burmese, but also Indian. But there's other, you know, like I don't think I've not been able to find anyone in the region of the Gulf, so Dubai, Qatar, Kuwait, even though they're being ruled by the viceroy, even though that they're using rupee, even though I've not found yet, and I'm sure there's going to be more scholarship to come, but I've not managed to find anyone who began to think that way, if that makes sense. There was like it was slow for a sense of nationhood to take hold.
Why were then places like East Africa, which used the Indian rupee and which were, for all intents and purposes, part of the British Empire, not then included in the British Indian Empire, considering a lot of Indians were shipped out there in order to build the infrastructure, and they essentially became the middle class eventually between the British and Africans. Like, is there anything that you can share that, like?
Yeah, so I think bear in mind what became the Indian Empire was just the bits that were taken over from the East India Company. And so the bits of that Britain rules in Africa are run by a separate building in Whitehall called the Colonial Office. And India was so vast, it might, like, so central. Like, Whitehall had 4 offices, okay? The Home Office, the Foreign Office, which dealt with, like, you know, basically kind of other countries like France, and kind of Thailand. You had the Colonial Office, which dealt with basically every other colony. And then you had the India Office, which was just for India,
for the Indian Empire.
The Indian Empire, because the Indian Empire was considered such a vast thing with such different traditions under the East India Company. It had been ruled by a company beforehand. So it gets a separate building and has separate traditions. So basically, like, you know, I mean, what I found fascinating as well in the research, there are moments in World War I when you get a bunch of basically Indians in what's now Tanzania, basically saying, maybe, like, you guys should attach this to India rather than give it to Whitehall, because, like, after all, isn't Aden, like, you know, Aden's hardly, you know, Indian, but there it is. And they use that as an argument to say maybe Tanzania should be attached to India, and it can become they literally use the word brown man's burden. So rather than the white man's burden to civilize the natives, according to Kipling, right? You would have basically Indians doing that job for, like, so there's this weird thing, but that never catches on for quite obvious reasons, right? Like, no one that catches on in kind of one small group of guys in Tanzania, and then a kind of, you know, 3 guys in Gujarat put in letters saying, oh, you know, actually that might be a good idea, but it kind of never really. But it's interesting that you do get people writing in suggesting it.
Yeah, I did wonder, considering obviously because of the trade, the rupee, the fact that there are so many Indians that are shipped out there. But no, yeah, it makes sense.
I think so often, we're so used to modern nationalism
Yes.
and the way that, like India belongs to Indians
Yeah.
and France belongs to French.
French, yeah.
And like in a time of empire, that's not necessarily a given.
But even when you
And
look
like
at those
it-
nation
yeah.
creation, those nation states being created, even with France, I remember looking at, and I'm sure it was recently, it was like an infographic of France, but it showed all the different dialects of French and how over time they were all essentially merged and created what is today modern French. So even the process of what you might think is a very straightforward nationalization, I guess, or creating a nation out of the French isn't actually as straightforward as it may seem to us today, especially when we're like, oh yeah, France is for the French. Well, it just seems as though that is like a bachelor is a independent, like is a, what is it, is a unmarried man. You almost seem as though it's by definition, but that's not obviously always the situation.
One of the things that I think I left this book with was a sense that there are no natural borders.
No, not
There are better and worse borders. And that's a different thing. So, like I think famously, the division of the Punjab was a particularly bad border. It went through areas that had never been divided before at a time when there was, everyone was coming back from World War II with a bunch of guns, having just been, and in the middle of this very tense moment. That's obviously one of the worst attempts to draw a border. By and large, borders, the sea is quite a good place to draw a border. But I think that we overestimate how much, like there is no natural wet place that the border should have fallen. It's like in every case, every border in the world was drawn up at some point by someone,
and
some
usually
are better
by violence as well.
Usually by violence.
Yeah.
Some are better, some are worse. Mountains tend to be good borders. Sea tends to be good
natural
borders.
are
Natural
different.
borders are different.
We've probably got about 10 to 15 minutes left, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions remaining.
Let's go.
So this
rapid fire.
This may be quick fire round. So we obviously spoke about the princely states, and I think, and this is something that we've kind of spoken about as we've been going through, which is your book highlights so many different situations where there are groups of people who, through various means, make a claim to nationhood, statehood, independence, however like you want to word that. And it's all obviously occurring during this fragmentation of the empire, which stretches over a lot longer period of time than we normally think in popular culture. So I think you started off in like 1937 and then all the way to 71. That's like 40 years almost. Now, one of the questions I want to ask you is, during all of this, what are Sikh leadership doing? Are they raising demands for protections, and are there any proposals for a Sikh state? And if they are, what happens to them? And if there aren't, why is there never a formal request for an independent Sikh homeland?
The crucial thing, I think, is that Sikhs we're unused to in the 21st century what Punjab actually looked like. Today, because we go to basically kind of, the Indian state of Punjab today, and it's kind of a Sikh majority, and it's the Golden Temple's at the center of it, etc. We really underestimate what actually that whole region looked like in the early 20th century, when Punjab is everywhere basically kind of, it's a Muslim majority state. It's a Muslim majority state. There is no district, with one or two exceptions, that is Sikh majority. But like Sikhs by and large are living in small numbers scattered out across Punjab. And Hindus in the east are the majority. But yeah, like I think that we, like the situation, like for example, Amritsar is Muslim majority. Right until, like Amritsar itself is Muslim majority right until 47.
And that only changes because of the forced migration and all of the violence.
And so there was at partition, interesting, there's no demand really for a separate Sikh state. There's a kind of couple mumblings about it, but it's never taken that seriously. And there's no mass marches in the streets. So I think by and large everyone was just expecting Punjab to go to one country or the other.
The whole of
Punjab.
Yes.
The demand for partitioning Punjab comes very late. And it stresses out the Sikh leadership because they kind of weren't expecting it.
Okay.
And so they were expecting a situation where probably the whole of Punjab was gonna either go to one country or the other, or potentially there would be an independent Punjab. And there was talk about an independent Punjab at various points. There are various proposals which are turned down that basically every one of India's provinces become independent and then choose to federalize after the fact if they want to.
So what happened? That's one of the questions. Sorry, what happens to this idea of India becoming a federation? Because that idea is brought up numerous times. I think even when Pakistan gets partitioned, there's even not obviously discussions of a federation, but there are kind of looking backs at the idea of, had this been a federation, maybe Pakistan wouldn't have been partitioned and split off. Why does that idea never take place? Because an idea of a federation seems like a far better solution for that area of the world than what occurred.
So I think what you're referring to is the cabinet mission plan, which is the one that's so tantalizing, and the one which everyone looks back now and is like, damn, that could have been amazing.
Had that, it would have been brilliant.
So you get, basically what happens is in August 1946, all the leaders, everyone, including Jinnah, agrees that you're going to get Pakistan, but you're also going to get a united India at the same time.
Yeah.
And the model that they take is basically the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
The UK has England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland that all become part of the UK. And in the same way, they're like, okay, let's do a system like that where we recognize that Pakistan is going to be a nation, just like Scotland is.
Yes.
We recognize that East Pakistan is also going to be a nation, like Wales is. We recognize that South India, Central India, and North India, so I think it was North India, South India, and Deccan were going to be the names for them. And they were going to have this 5-part state. 5 states that collectively, and 2 of which would be Muslim majority, 2 of which would be Hindu majority, and then the Deccan was pretty mixed, right? Like, it had Jains, it had Hindus, it had Muslims, and everyone. And Jinnah accepts, and he's like, yeah, that's kind of what I was after. Nehru accepts, Gandhi accepts, Mountbatten accepts, it's go. And then at the last moment, the Congress guys pull out because of the most anodyne reason, which just infuriates everyone. They pull out because they've recently got elected in Peshawar, in the Northwest Frontier. The Northwest Frontier is a Congress. And so they basically say, okay, we can do this 5-part system, but we want to make sure that, like, the Northwest Frontier isn't part of the Pakistani state of the Federation. It's like the smallest nitpick. They're like, the Northwest Frontier should be part of the North Indian section rather than the Pakistan section. And it's like the tiniest nitpick. But Jinnah is like, we had this agreed on paper. If you are pulling out now, then I can't trust you when you guys become in charge of basically the central government of the state, inevitably, like, you will just screw me over. Like, if I can't trust you now, I can't trust you ever. And that's when he announces Direct Action Day. Direct Action Day leads to the first partition riots, and everything goes south from there. The moment that the first partition riots happen, in the wake of Direct Action Day, everyone's refusing to talk to each other. Everyone's like, these guys are murderers. And so all communication breaks down, and you lose. But it's so within reach. And this is the thing that I think every historian who really looks at the documents is just heartbroken. Looking at the cabinet mission plan would, like, I mean, it's another question. Would it have worked? You know, like, would this have inevitably led to other, like, it's impossible to know. But there is bear in mind, this is before any partition violence. There is a world where they said yes, where basically Nehru and Gandhi don't suggest that Peshawar had become part of the North Indian state rather than the Pakistan. Like, this tiny nitpick, it could have worked, I think.
I think so as well. I do wonder. I definitely think it would have been a better solution for the problem they're trying to solve.
I would agree.
Okay, 10 minutes and a number of questions
Okay,
left.
let's
quick fire. We've spoken about Bangladesh, so I will leave that one out. Okay, so your research combines deep archival work with interviews in multiple languages, including Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, and Burmese. How did all of these different interviews with all these different people in all these different languages help enrich your understanding and portrayal of these historical events? And was there anything where you were like, hold on, can you say that again? Because actually it's something that you were just completely unaware of, and then you were like, that changes the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, so that guy who I met from Tripura, I think, was that moment.
Yeah.
And likewise, I think there was the Yemeni Sultan from Hyderabad kind of thing. That story was wild. I think so. I think the way that I got into this was through Project Dastaan and through doing oral histories. And so at the beginning, it wasn't necessarily going to be narrative history. It was going to be much more like Anchal's books as a collection of letting people tell their own stories. And I feel like that's ultimately where my training is, right? Like, and through Dastaan, we had already kind of something like 70 interviews, which we're going to try and archive, and you can go online and listen to them on the Dastaan website. And I thought that, so my understanding was definitely shaped by doing oral histories and realizing how much, like with Iqbal, who is this guy who, when asked about partition, would say, "Oh, Nehru did this, Gandhi did this, Jinnah did this. Oh, and never trust a Sikh, never trust Indians. They genocided us, etc." He's Pakistani now. Well, he's British now, but British Pakistani. And it was only when we asked him about his childhood best friend, who that, like, did he ever know any Hindus or Sikhs? And he's like, the one person I want to see before I die is Narendra Singh, who's my Sikh best friend from childhood. And suddenly, the moment that you asked him about his childhood, it opened up a different story. And I think that taught me a lot of lessons, and letting people tell their own stories, I think, is very valuable. I think so much of it is through, like, I can do interviews myself in Hindi and Urdu, but through the other languages were basically reliant on incredible translators who I had with me. And so kind of shout out to all of them quickly, because like this wouldn't have been Kosai in Burma, Joe Schmither in Bengal. Like, I mean, there's too many to mention, but like, like none of this would have been possible without all of them. And I think it's also important to doing interviews in other languages. I think that one of the things we quickly realized when we were doing Dastaan is that if you only do interviews in English, you will get caught into this kind of class caste bubble, and you'll only get people who have a very particular view on what went down.
Yes.
Like, if you're doing it, so the way we started with Project Dastaan is we basically accepted interviews from Instagram, from people messaging us in English. And it was only 2 years into the project that we began to realize that pretty much everyone was, from urban, big cities, only literally like one or two people from any sort of, non-upper caste background, and basically no Dalits, and basically no kind of like smaller communities. And that was what we subsequently really tried hard to find. I do think that there's an amazing thing called the 1947 Partition Archive based in Berkeley, and they've been doing the first proper widespread interviews of everyone from different communities, different parts of the subcontinent.
Have you seen that book that they've produced?
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's so
It's
heavy.
so good. It's proper.
I got it the other day. Another historian basically got me a PR copy and was like, "Here, can you do something with it?" I was like, "Of course." And the postman delivered it, and I got it off him, and I was like, "Whoa!"
But it's so
mammoth
thorough.
piece of work.
And when I was researching this, I remember I think I first used their archive for the Hyderabad section, and I was literally able to say, like, do you have any Dalit voices? Do you have any like Parsi voices? And they've got them. And like in a way that it would have been so difficult for me to find by going out, like I need someone who remembers the events of Operation Polo, but from like, someone who didn't belong to any of the major communities.
And trying to connect you to that person. How do you do that?
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
we are quickly running out of time, and I
let's
want to ask you two questions to wrap up. One is kind of relating to what we spoke about earlier about how the nation state has its own flaws and issues, right? So the legacies even of these partitions are evident in ongoing issues like the Rohingya crisis and insurgencies in regions like Kashmir, Northeast India, and anyone who is familiar with Punjabi history, everything that happened during the 70s and 80s and 90s. What I want to ask is, how do you see echoes of those partitions in present day conflicts, and what is your estimation of where that part of the world is going towards? Because it seems like obviously with the Pakistan India flare up recently, things seem almost on a precipice in terms of how relations are. And these crises like the Rohingya crisis and also the stuff that is occurring. So for argument's sake, it made a lot more sense to me after reading your book why there is so much tension and violence in Manipur, which is on the border of India and Burma, I believe.
Yeah.
So with all of that kind of just out there, what is your opinion of this? Like, do you think that that part of the country, the world, can actually get away from the legacies of partition? So for argument's sake, Kashmir is a problem that is inherently linked to partition. The Rohingya crisis, inherently linked. The violence in Manipur, inherently linked. Is there a way out for any of these?
Yes, and I think yes, there is, and I think that they need to be addressed rather than ignored. I think that we far too often treat these as intractable problems that have always existed and will always go on. I think it was Trump recently was talking about how, Kashmir, they've been at war over Kashmir for thousands of years. It's like, no, it's within living memory. But not only that, the Indian-Pakistan partition happened on the basis of what happened in Ireland, which was the British Empire's first partition on the basis of religion.
Yes.
And then the same thing was subsequently carried out in Mandate Palestine, creating an Arab and a Jewish state, right? Two of these conflicts is in the news every day for its violence. India and Pakistan and Israel, Palestine. Like, we can just see what's happening in Gaza. We can see what's happening in Kashmir recently. Everything from everything just looks dire.
Yeah.
I think my hot take is that Ireland shows us what a successful peace process looks like. And that, as recently as the 90s, the Troubles were just as dangerous. And Northern Ireland was in a really bad situation with bombs going off the whole time and bombs going off in London, etc.
Yeah.
And I remember when India and Pakistan were kind of firing missiles at each other recently, in the wake of the Pahalgam attack, we Googled what was news in Ireland, and it was more money put into peace building, the relations never better kind of thing. And for it's inconceivable now to young people in Ireland today, to a return to the 90s in a way that was just not imaginable 30 years ago. I mean, it's not to say that the peace process has been perfect. And there's still ways to go, and there's still a massive kind of cultural divide and all sorts, but it's healing. And I think that it's the only successful disappearance of a partition border that we've seen in the 20th century. And I think that, and I think it's a model which we should all be thinking about very, very carefully. I think one of the, on this note, soon after the Good Friday Agreement, basically kind of, created a demilitarized area, kind of allowed people on both sides of Ireland to cross over to, visit each other and visit old family members on the other side. Very soon afterwards, you had the, I think it was the Vajpayee, and I can't remember if it was Musharraf, or it was one of the Pakistani prime ministers, where they basically suggested the same thing. And you chat to Indian politicians and Pakistani politicians, and they'll say that the Vajpayee agreement was the closest they ever got to the resolving Kashmir, and it basically said demilitarization. Kashmir should be allowed to move on both sides of the LOC. The LOC becomes a harder border, but it shouldn't be there for basically Kashmiris. So freedom of movement, and liberation without independence. And there were all these tenets that they basically agreed to, which were on the basis of the Good Friday Agreement, and it's the closest we've ever got to resolving the conflict. And you chat to people today, and they'll literally just say we were within an inch. And then I think it was I think there was suddenly some people in the Pakistani army wanted to throw it under the bus, and so there was some shooting over the LOC, and suddenly everyone pulled away, and it was at the 11th hour.
I really like that answer, because I've never actually thought of it like that, and equally it goes to show that there is hope and there is a way forward, which is really cool. All right, we're gonna get kicked out in a minute, so my last question is, how do you hope? I can answer this question for you, but I want you to answer this, so I'm gonna put it to you, which is, how do you hope this brilliant book over here will influence the way we understand and teach the history of South Asia and partition?
So I think that particularly in Britain, I think that partition, 1947 partition, is the central event of the 20th century for a quarter of the world's population, and should be studied on par with the other great moments of the 20th century, from the other great tragedies, from the Holocaust to the Rwandan genocide through to World Wars I and II. It's as big a moment, and it's something that it's appalling that people in this country don't necessarily know about in in the way that it's one of the central moments of 20th century history. I think the other partitions also, I think putting it all in context and realizing that these borders didn't just show up out of the blue.
Yes.
Understanding what India actually was in the 1920s, and I think it's very different. It looks different to how we imagine it. And I think every single country has its own nationalist myths that they grow up with, and with each border, new nationalist myths are basically written about, basically to make these new borders sound timeless.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that no borders are timeless and nationhood is inherently something that's kind of forged.
Yeah, completely.
know?
I just want to say thank you. You've driven up for this, and I've taken up a lot of your day, and you have been I could go on for hours. I always have this problem, which is I always think 90 minutes, 2 hours is long enough, and then we start talking, and it never is. But I just want to say thank you so much. As in, it's a brilliant piece of work. You are a brilliant writer, and your ability to take anybody through these quite complex topics is something that I think a lot of people when they read it is going to be like, wow. So yeah, across the board, I just proverbial hats off to you, as they would say, right? And long may it continue. The work you guys are doing with Project Dastaan, the work that you're doing with this, your Substack, the images that you're posting on your Instagram and Twitter, it's just incredible. And keep it up, because people like myself really appreciate it. And yeah, I just want to leave it at that. Oh, and obviously, if anyone wants to buy a copy of the book, the link will be below in the description. And if anyone wants to check out the Project Dastaan, again, links will be in the description. And anything else that is of importance will be below too. So,
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Okay.
I love this. This is why I love doing this, because I get the opportunity to talk to people like yourself and essentially bore you guys to death.
No, I had a great time. Thank you for having me.
Oh wow. Oof. There's still so much I could ask, which is always
Okay, bro.
the issue.
Oh, I know it's great. Grab a